Welcome to this week's Halftime Talk, a moment every week where we take a deep dive into some of the issues and trends impacting the global energy markets. And we're delighted this week to be joined by Mr. David Rundell, who is the author of a new book, The Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
David, as probably the longest serving US diplomat in Saudi Arabia, there's a number of words in the title of your book that grab my attention: vision, mirage. But most importantly, I'd like to start with the word crossroads. Saudi Arabia at a crossroads. Ultimately, a crossroads in its imagery is where a number of roads come into a center, if you like, and then we've got to choose which pathway we might go forward with. So I'd like to start with, what are the crossroads? What are the roads that are running into this intersection? And then maybe we can talk which is the road forward for the kingdom. So what are the roads running into your crossroads?
Well, I think one of the themes of the book is that Saudi Arabia has been a lot more stable than many people predicted for a long time. If you look behind me, you see dozens of books, many of them predicting the imminent collapse of the Al Saud. They have been a lot more stable than many people expected, including many people in the US government. That fact is that now, today, they are rather less stable than many people presume. Since 2015, the stability of the country has declined. I wouldn't say that it is unstable, but it is definitely less stable. And why is that? Well, to answer that, we sort of have to look at why it was stable in the first place and see what's changed. And those are the things that lead us to these crossroads that you're alluding to or talking about. So why was Saudi Arabia stable for a long time? First of all, the Al Saud family effectively created the country. In the beginning of the 20th century, the King Ibn Saud knit together dozens of tribes and villages, city-states, and created a country where none had existed before. And that gives him his family historic legitimacy. A second factor was their ability to handle succession peacefully and repeatedly. They were able to quickly transfer power from one king to another, really 6 or 7 times for over the last 60 years. And again, that's something that many countries in the Arab world were unable to do. That provided legitimacy for the regime, and legitimacy is the foundation really of the stability. The third leg of their table was that they created a coalition of stakeholders. The coalition of stakeholders, each of those groups have an elite leadership, which has a symbiotic relationship with the monarchy. So the monarchy helps those leaders remain in charge of their group, and those leaders represent the interests of their group to the monarchy, which balances competing interests and factions. Just very quickly, who are those groups? The tribes, the religious leadership, the merchant class, the technocratic, Western educated leader technocrats, and the royal family itself, which is tens of thousands of people. I distinguish between a royal family, which is tens of thousands, and a ruling family, which is at the most a couple dozen. So each of these stakeholder groups, as they maintained a elite cohesion amongst these stakeholder groups. That's the third leg. And then the fourth leg of the table really was just the ability of the Al Saud to provide competent government. What do we mean by competent government? They provided security, both internal and external, where in many countries in this part of the world and in Saudi Arabia before the Al Saud came, there wasn't much security. They provided economic development, which anyone who saw Saudi Arabia 30 years ago can certainly attest to. And finally, they provided gradual social change at a pace that most people in a conservative society were able to, that they would agree with. So That's why.
If you take that four-legged table as you describe it, I'm wondering, does the House of Saud, which again, as you've articulated, has maintained beyond most people's expectation a stable country for 80 years or so, does the House of Saud still exist?
Most definitely. I mean, it may not exist in the same way that it did collectively, but it certainly still exists. Yes. And
I mean, a house indicates that there are many people. I'm wondering how many people are now in the House of Saud?
Okay. Well, how many people are in the House of Saud? Thousands, tens of thousands of princes, most of whom will have no role in the government and no chance of becoming king. And those people, just to quickly summarize it, each of those legs have been weakened in the last 5 years. And I'll answer your question on the El Saud one in just a second. The historic legitimacy is fading because young people it's like, Americans trying to remember the Civil War. It's something that happened a long time ago. So that is fading as a memory. It was very real for their grandparents. It's not so real for them. The succession issue has become more complicated. And that is where I wanted to talk to you about the royal family. People say that King Salman ended the system of collegial rule by these brothers. Basically, King Faisal set up a system where there were half a dozen senior princes who cooperated, who each ran their own ministry, who each had to some extent their own budget, their own authority, their own financial ecosystem that revolved around them.
Even their own governance. I mean, they had their own little governance.
They did. So there was a lot of independence and collective consensus building. King Fahd, I remember at one time he told the ambassador at that time that I wasn't the acting ambassador, and he said, the Gulf War was the only time that he had ever made a decision on his own without consulting a broad collection of his brothers and cousins and uncles. So it was a consensus-driven system. Now, people say that that made it very slow, okay? That had its good and its bad. It made it stable, but it made decision-making very slow. The system did not, King Salman did not end the system. The system ended itself because the brothers all died and he had to come up with a new system. So this was always going to be a real issue. It could have definitely been a problem for stability in that hundreds of people, or certainly dozens, thought they should be the next king. There were 34 sons, there were over 500 grandsons. So the king engineered the rise of Mohammed bin Salman and effectively removed 2 crown princes and put the guy that he thought would do the best job in place. We may like that guy or we may not, but he's now pretty clearly going to be the next king. The stability issue is what would happen if something were to happen to him, if he were fired, if he died. There is no number 3 person at the moment. Traditionally, there is a number 1, a number 2, and a number 3. There is no number 3 now. And so it's not at all clear what would happen should Mohammed bin Salman leave the scene. So there is a sort of key man risk in stability now that didn't exist, 5 years ago.
Does this, do you think, resemble increasingly more the sort of political structure we've seen in other Arab countries, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, that in the nationalist era, as compared to this consensus tent that you describe up till this point in Saudi Arabia, that we're now seeing emerge in the kingdom, something more akin to what we've seen historically in the other major national Arab states?
Well, I think if that's probably the key crossroad that we are at. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, Saudi Arabia will evolve into either a more accountable monarchy or a police state. And I would say that almost all other Arab governments, certainly the republics, are effectively police states, military dictatorships. The Saudis, Americans tend to lump monarchies along with tyranny. They tend to think that there are three kinds of government, or two kinds. And most Americans think there were two. You're either a republic where the emphasis is on individual liberty and human rights, or you're a dictatorship which is governed by fear and an authority. In fact, most of Europe was governed by a monarchy for most of its history, and every monarch was not a tyrant. Americans tend to equate those two because of our experience with George III, and we concluded that he was a tyrant and we had to have our revolution. But most people in Europe were not spending their time trying to think, well, I didn't vote for Henry VIII, so he can't be a legitimate king. They accepted that system. So there is the ability for a monarchy to evolve. Many monarchies in Europe did evolve. And I believe that the Saudis have an opportunity and a chance to evolve, in part, to a large part, because they were never colonized. Most of these other Arab dictatorships, and I would use that word, are post-colonial governments. So the traditional Arab Islamic government that existed was essentially uprooted by colonial administrators who brought in their own system, who said, you need to have a parliament, you need to have legislatures, you need to have law codes, we need to dismiss the ulama, they don't really count anymore. This did not happen in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is really the only major Arab country that wasn't colonized in some way or other. And so they still have a lot of their own traditional political system and their own legal system.
In a way, with Mohammed bin Salman as the crown prince and his father, King Salman, as a slightly, let's say, narrower architecture. There isn't as wide a pyramid, if you like, giving such a wide base of support to that political structure. What about
that's true.
What about the other pieces you mentioned, the religious and the commercial? How do they now? I mean, the religious, where are they gone? And
all of those people, all of those groups have some reason to be unhappy, with the possible exception of the tribes, who are still, they didn't really get their cart turned over too much by Vision 2030. But the religious people have certainly seen their influence decline. The merchants are not happy about being told to hire Saudis and pay taxes. The technocrats, the middle-class people, have seen their gasoline subsidies cut, their electricity subsidies cut, their VAT has increased to 15%. They have reason to be unhappy. And the royal family has a lot of reasons to be unhappy, because they have seen their prerogatives diminished. Everything from now, they're paying their electric bills, which they didn't used to pay. They're no longer, some of them were thrown in the Ritz. Some of them were questioned by commoners. Some of them, they have seen their halo slip quite a bit. This was essential. I think it's important to mention that this was part of the change in the monarchy, which had to happen, in my view, if the monarchy was going to succeed. You take a look at Britain. Most British people are quite happy to pay great deference and great respect to the Queen. And they're quite happy to see that she lives in a large palace, has a big yacht, has a big art collection, and gets some money from the state. They would not be happy if they were expected to behave that way towards 10,000 dukes and earls and barons and counts and marquises and all of these other people who basically are not treated specially anymore. And so the days when a prince could bump you off a seat in an airplane, which did happen. I mean, you know, I'm a prince and I'm getting on and you have a seat. That's too bad. I've seen that happen. It did happen. So that sort of thing upset people. And I think that it had to come to an end if the monarchy was going to remain popular. The other thing which was a threat to the monarchy was corruption. Corruption was, by what we would call corruption, was quite widely spread. King Salman has been opposed to corruption all of his career, and he was not able to really enforce that when he was only governor of Riyadh. Once he became king, he began to crack down on that. And again, so his crackdown on corruption and his limiting the prerogatives of, if you will, the average random prince, were very popular moves with the people, and I think have helped solidify the monarchy.
But I wanted to pick up on the point of oil and the obviously the role that plays and the things you can control and the things that you can't control. But the big signature event of the Vision 2030 in terms of oil was the IPO of Aramco. Of course, it wasn't in the classic sense of New York Stock Exchange and 100% floated, but ultimately a step in a certain pathway to changing. I'm wondering what your view on that is now in the rearview mirror that it's happened. Has it been a signature moment as it was envisaged in the first place? And where do you think it goes moving forward?
I think that the sale of Aramco, or the IPO of Aramco, was a positive move. It made a lot of sense. Many people, including myself, had suggested it a long time ago. The Saudis have a lot of oil sitting in the ground that earns them nothing. Far better to monetize some of that reserve and invest that money, even go and buy treasury bonds with it. You'll get some kind of return. So the idea of monetizing some of their reserves, even if you think those reserves are someday going to be valuable, but on the other hand, some would argue that, 20 years from now, no one's going to want your oil. So if you can monetize some of that today, that makes a great deal of sense. So that's one reason why I think it was a smart idea. It also brought some private sector discipline. Aramco has always been one of the better, maybe the best run of the national oil companies, but nonetheless, bringing a private sector ownership into it to some extent, I think was a positive step. So it's not really a government, it is a parastatal. I mean, it's not, it functions in very differently than most government oil companies, but nonetheless, it's now become even more of like a private company to some extent. And that's helpful in terms of efficiency. I do think that it was also a step in the direction of the centralizing of control, in the sense that I do think that there were people in Aramco who didn't like this idea, who felt that that they should maintain their complete independence, and they were overruled by the Crown Prince. And I think that's an example of his increasing control over all of these independent fiefdoms. So my bottom line is, I think it was a good idea. I haven't looked at the price today, but I think most people they're still paying their dividends. So most people, I think most people, I don't know, you probably know better than I do what the price is today, but most people haven't lost money, I don't think. A lot of people made money.
Well, it's certainly very early days in terms of looking at it from an investment point of view, but as a symbolic transformational moment as part of Vision 2030, I think it certainly served its purpose.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's true. As a symbol, it's not the only thing that's being privatized. It's the flagship privatization.
Yes.
But yes, I think that there is a part of Vision 2030 is to try and privatize many state-owned assets, and this was a first step in that direction, or not really the first step, but a major step.
One of the big questions, and you alluded to it in your previous comment, is stranded assets that you would leave. There's a lot of money under the ground in those billions of oil barrels. I think the Aramco's underground reserves is somewhere near 300 billion barrels. The question I have is one that the industry is asking, and that is, when will Saudi and its peer group, led by Saudi, OPEC in particular, ever move away from this unique posture of controlling supply to maximize price? It's probably the only commodity in which, I mean, diamonds, perhaps one might argue, does the same thing, but the idea that you would just unleash the supply and maximize return through volume rather than through controlling supply. And I'm wondering your thoughts on whether that Saudi Arabia is anywhere closer to that, or what your thoughts would be for that shift in strategy.
I think that Saudi Arabia's role in oil markets is political as well as economic. I think they depend on the West, and particularly the United States, for their security. What makes them worth defending is not the fact that they can produce a lot of oil cheaply. It's the fact that they maintain a surplus or surge capacity, which they can turn on and turn off. This is not a commercial decision. It is a political decision. It costs them tens of billions of dollars, but when there is a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico or a strike in Venezuela, or for that matter, when the United States wants to put an embargo on Iran or Iraq invades Kuwait, the people who can make that up are really only the Saudis. And I think that that gives them their standing geopolitically, and I don't think that they would be inclined to give that up. I also, I am in the oil business in a small way in West Texas, and so I follow this on a pretty regular basis for my own investments. And so I've seen the market rise and fall and rise and fall over a long period of time. The Saudis understand that the global supply curve has shifted, that fracking, 3D seismic, horizontal drilling, all of this has changed the global market, that they're not going to see $100 a barrel oil, and they're probably going to lose market share. But they still, I think, are going to maintain their role in OPEC. I think they're still going to try to maintain their relationship with Russia. And I think they're still going to try and adjust prices to their own benefit. So I don't see that changing. I would say one last thing, and that is that when I said I watched the oil markets, what I was starting to say is that I remember very clearly 10 years ago, everybody was telling me about peak oil and how we had reached, and you probably know about this, the people listening know very well what I'm talking about, the concept that we were going to go into permanent decline, and that the United States had produced all the oil it could. And that I never bought that at the time, and I don't buy the peak demand or argument any more now than I did. And I just tell you, I mean, the 20% of global oil is used for transportation. The other 80% is used for other things in terms of hydrocarbons. So I don't think it's going to go away. I think that it's going to continue to grow. And I saw a number, I'll just give you a number, and then I'll stop on this. But I saw the other day, I saw the number that said right today, there's 1.5 billion cars in the world. And in 20 years, there's going to be, or 15 years, there's going to be 2 billion. And of that 2 billion, 500 million are going to be electric, which still means there's 1.5 billion that aren't electric. So I don't see the oil demand collapsing, and it could be done by fiat, by governments, but other than that, I don't really see it happening. So I think, anyway, I think the Saudis are going to continue with their role in OPEC for a long time.
Okay, well, let's just wrap up, David, with the most imminent news coming, which is the US presidential election. And in the context of what the outcome could be, obviously it could be two things: continuation of a second Trump administration or a new Biden administration. I'm wondering, from your perspective, what would be the ramifications of either path for Saudi Arabia's sort of journey as it transforms to the new thing it's trying to become? How does the intersection with either a second Trump or a Biden administration impact that?
Well, I think if Trump is reelected, the relationship will go on much the way it is, and the Saudis will work with the Trump administration on resolving the Arab-Israeli dispute. I think that if the Biden people win, you will see a downturn. You will see people complaining about the war in Yemen. You will see people complaining about arms sales to Saudi Arabia. You will see people complaining about Jamal Khashoggi's death. But I have to say that ultimately, I don't think that it will change. I think that there will be a lot of noise. But I've watched, it's rather like oil prices. I mean, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States goes up and down, but there are constant factors of common interest there. So what this relates with the Biden people is a fundamental tension in foreign policy, which is between protecting your interests and promoting your values. And either, if you go overboard on either side, if you abandon your values, you got nothing worth protecting. If you abandon your interests, you have no way to protect your values. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi was a crime. It needs to be punished. It needs not to be repeated. But on the other hand, the United States has interests in its partnership with Saudi Arabia, which go beyond oil, which include counterterrorism, the security of Israel, the stability of the region. And those interests need cooperation. So I think that even a Biden administration will continue to cooperate. I think that they will recognize the importance of the Saudis in the oil market. When the American oil industry was collapsing as a result of COVID, who did President Trump call? Not to get them to cut prices, but to get them to cut production. He called the Saudis. I mean, they're the people that you can call to get to do something. He didn't call Putin, I don't think. Well, he did call him, but I mean, he was relying more on the Saudis.
Well, on that point of the Biden-Trump thing, the general sort of criticism or analysis of the current approach with Biden or with Trump is that it's non-institutional, and you're a former diplomat. You're obviously part of the institution of government relations, that the Democratic administration would bring back an institutional relationship between Saudi Arabia and US and not a personal relationship. I'm wondering what your view on that analysis is, and do you indeed agree with it, and would that be the case?
I think that it's true for most countries and not true for Saudi Arabia. You look at the relationship with the United States and Britain, it doesn't really matter who the president is. It doesn't really matter who the ambassador is. There are very deep relationships there that are institutionalized and have been for 60 years, more than that. That's not true in Saudi Arabia. Who the president is, who the king is, how they get along, it makes a difference. Who the ambassador is makes a difference. The ambassador to Saudi Arabia is almost always a political appointee. There's a reason for that. That the institution, if you will, is to some extent cut out. And that's true. I mean, the ambassadors that you get in Saudi Arabia are almost always people who have some personal relationship with the president and can call the White House if they want to. That's not true in most countries. Whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, I mean, people would argue. I thought it was a good thing. I thought that the political ambassadors that we had in Saudi Arabia that I worked for did a good job, and that their access to the senior leadership was helpful. And the Saudis, they have a king. So, you know, they have, at the end of the day, there's one guy who's going to make a decision there too. So I think that answers your question, that yes, the Democrats probably would use more institutions for most relationships, but the Saudi one is a special case.
Well, let's finish off there with the special case. David Rundell, author of Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at a Crossroads. Thank you very much for your insights. Best of luck with your book. Incredible read. and we look forward to catching up with you again soon. Thank you for being on this week's Halftime Talk.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.